Welcome back to the train room, and welcome back to another edition of Train Talk with Chicago Crossing Model Railroad. I'm Eric, glad to be with you as usual. So last time we talked about 4 different things that Chicago Crossing does really well as a small layout. But self-critique is a critical component of our ability to advance in the hobby. And I'm never afraid to look at a railroad like this and say, here's what it needs in order to do better. It's how we get better as model railroaders. It's how we get better as model builders and model makers. And so from my perspective, there are 3 things that Chicago Crossing really had to compromise on. And so we'll talk about those things today on Chicago Crossing Train Talk Volume 2. The first major issue with Chicago Crossing is the lack of crossovers and sidings for the layout. So let's review the track plan. As you can see, Chicago Crossing has 7 industries. 3 of them are located on a branch line. There's also an interchange and a yard. Given what's already on here, and given the size of the layout, it's really impossible to add sidings to move trains off of in order for other trains to pass. You would have to increase the depth of the layout. Given the layout is surrounded on 3 sides by walls, it means it's impossible to do because at that point I can't reach back if the train derails or in order to work on scenery. So the reach issue is significant. Well, in the absence of sidings, your other option is a crossover. But as you can see, Chicago Crossing only has a pair of crossovers right at the front. In addition, these crossovers are really limited in size. They're simply about 2 car lengths between each other, with the vertical lift bridge in the middle. This actually presents a real problem. On the one hand, it does allow for trains to move from one track to another, but only in one place. And because of the short length, it makes it really difficult to do a runaround operation where you need to remove the locomotive from one side and move it onto the other. You literally can do that for something like only a single car. As a beginner, this wasn't something that ever occurred to me. I wasn't well versed in train operations and I had never run a model railroad before. So things like runaround operations or siding protection was not in my vocabulary. So how would I fix this? Well, this is my idea, is to add 2 more crossovers. And what this would allow for is better runaround operations and the capacity to protect sidings such as the grain elevator, or to be able to switch in and out of the branch line without other trains interfering. The next issue with Chicago Crossing has to do with excess and redundant trackage. When I was developing the layout plan for Chicago Crossing, I really loved the idea of having as many opportunities to switch industries as possible. I had actually added in 2 spurs that weren't part of the original plan. Those are numbers 6 and 7, as you can see on the track plan here. My rationale was that I could use the extra track as a way to spot loads or empties as these industries were being switched. But the truth is, most of that trackage never was particularly useful. The only industry where I found having double track to be of any use was actually just at the grain elevator. And that industry was actually triple tracked. That 3rd track is something I've rarely used. It currently serves as a parking spot for the Trackmobile model that I have on there. And that seems well and good. I scenicked it to make it look like it is barely used because that's a reflection of the truth of the layout. Nowadays, that excess track in the refinery simply serves as a parking spot for cars. Likewise, the dual track siding for what eventually became the bakery really was redundant. I ended up not needing that track, and I'm still thinking I may just delete the extra track entirely. For the moment, its entire reason for being is simply to serve the grain silo. In addition, some of the spurs were simply built too long. They had excess track on them that really didn't need to be there. It went well beyond the point at which cars would be spotted. This was true for both the grain mill as well as for the refinery. In the end, I either removed the track altogether, or, as you can see in the refinery, I simply made it so it looked like it was abandoned and maybe at one point had actually intersected with the main. If there's a take-home message out of all of this, it's that Chicago Crossing had or has a substantial amount of redundant track. Most of the industries that I have in real life are usually served by a single track. So be careful as you plan. Make sure that when you design your layout, that you design the amount of track that prototypically would be required for the type of industries that you're placing on your railroad. The third issue with Chicago Crossing has to do with non-prototypical scenery. When Chicago Crossing was first designed, I actually didn't have Chicago in mind for it. Rather, I was going to model some of the outer parts of Chicago and Illinois. And that starting error meant that the layout itself had to undergo a lot of revision. It originally wasn't built with the idea of having dense industry. So initially, things like all of the industries on the north side didn't actually have concrete. And I had to do a lot of revising in order to suddenly make Chicago, well, look like Chicago. Aside from that, the layout was designed and built with all sorts of scenery features that simply aren't found in the area. Things like bluffs or rock cuts where a track would come through. And these are the sorts of things that you actually can find in Illinois. Anybody who's visited Starved Rock will know that you can see exactly these same rock formations. But nonetheless, what that means is the layout now has features that really aren't associated with the area. In addition to that, as a small layout, one of the features that I talked about in the last episode that actually works well are view blocks. Well, two of the major view blocks in Chicago Crossing are tunnels. But here's the thing, there are no tunnels in Chicago. At least not the kind that carry this sort of rail traffic. There definitely are tunnels. They usually tend to flood, however. So does this mean I've lost all credibility when it comes to realism? I mean, I'm a guy who perseverates about making scale barbed wire or CTA signs or where the garbage is or, God forbid, making signs for retired Chicago weathermen. And meanwhile, my trains are passing through structures that belong in Pennsylvania. How do you square the circle? So one way I think about it is, what is the tunnel actually good for, and is there actually an adequate substitute? You know, in Chicago you have things like freeway overpasses over rail, you have things like embankments that take track up above other track and stuff like that. But the thing is, on a layout this small, none of those items have the same sort of disruption of object permanence that a tunnel does, because you can still see the trains as they run underneath a freeway. But when they pass through a tunnel, they're sort of transported, even if you can see one end coming out of one side and the other end still going in the other. So on some level, what we simply have to do is take the artistic license that comes with having a small layout. And likewise, I suspect the time and trouble to rip out these tunnels and replace them with something else probably just isn't worth it in the big picture of what the artistic mission is for Chicago Crossing Model Railroad. So with all that in mind, how much is there really left to do? And are any of the deficiencies that I mentioned here worth spending the time to clear up? When is the layout actually done? When does all this end and layout number 2 start? We'll tackle that in the next edition of Train Talk here on Chicago Crossing Model Railroad.